To service any internal components, you will need to remove the bezel stand assembly. To remove the bezel stand assembly, first remove the 3 small rubber feet at the bottom of the unit. To do so, use a flat-headed tool to pry each foot off of the unit. Remove the 3 Phillips No. 2 screws that secure the bezel stand assembly to the PC. Pull the bezel stand assembly off of the unit. There is a notched corner of the bezel stand assembly that aligns with the rear I/O corner of the PC. To replace the bezel stand assembly, align the notched corner to the rear I/O corner and press the bezel stand assembly into place. Replace the 3 Phillips No. 2 screws to secure the bezel stand assembly to the PC. Press the 3 rubber feet back onto the bottom of the unit. The feet are interchangeable. To remove the chassis cover, first remove the bezel stand assembly. There are several connectors preventing immediate full removal of the cover. Slide the chassis cover partially up from an upside-down position. Detach the front microphone connector and the speakers and USB cables from the front I/O board. Note that the USB connector should be pulled straight out from the board, not up. Slide the cover up just slightly more to access and detach the motherboard connector from the front I/O board. Carefully slide the chassis cover all the way up and off of the unit. There are plastic grooves on the open edges of the chassis cover that slide over the side edges of the rear I/O bezel on the PC. To replace the chassis cover, align the top of the grooves on the cover over the rear I/O bezel. Make sure all the disconnected connectors are accessible at the bottom of the unit before you slide the cover partially onto the unit. Reconnect the front I/O motherboard connector to the front I/O board. Slide the cover down slightly further. Replace the speakers and USB cables to the front I/O board. Replace the microphone connector to the microphones. Finish sliding the chassis cover all the way down onto the unit. Make sure the microphone's connector is tucked down inside the PC. To remove the hard drive, first remove the bezel stand assembly and the chassis cover. Detach the power and data connectors from the hard drive. Detach the 4 Phillips No. 2 screws securing the hard drive assembly in the computer. Remove the metal washer with each screw when you remove the screws. Slide the hard drive out of the PC. To install a hard drive, slide the hard drive into its bay on the PC with the spindle side facing out until the screw holes on the hard drive align with the screw holes on the PC. Make sure each screw has its metal washer attached to the screw with the tab on the washer dipping down from the screw head. Replace the 4 Phillips No. 2 screws to secure the hard drive in the PC. It can be tricky to get the top hard drive screws close enough to the chassis wall unless you press something behind the hard drive against the outer wall of the drive bay. Make sure the long tab of the metal washer for each screw is pointing toward the top of the unit and covering the small square hole near the screw. Replace the power and data connectors to the hard drive. To remove system memory, first remove the bezel stand assembly and the chassis cover. Pull off the USB dongle. Remove the Torx 15 screw that secures the memory shielding to the PC. Slide the shielding toward the bottom of the unit and remove the shielding from the PC. Simultaneously push down on the clips on either side of the DDR4 DIMM socket to release the memory module. Carefully pull out the memory module. There is one notch on the bottom of every DDR4 DIMM module, offset from the center, that fits over a tab in the DDR4 DIMM memory socket. When installing DDR4 DIMMs, align the notch on the module with the tab in the socket. Press the module into the socket until the clips on both sides of the socket lock into place. The memory shielding has 4 slots that fit over 4 tabs on the chassis. To replace the shielding, align the slots slightly below their tabs and slide the shielding into place. Replace the Torx 15 screw to secure the memory shielding to the PC. Replace the USB dongle. To remove the front I/O board, first remove the bezel stand assembly and the chassis cover. Pull down on the 2 hooked tabs that help secure the front I/O assembly to the chassis cover and pull the I/O assembly out of the cover. Remove the 2 Torx 15 screws that secure the I/O bezel to the I/O board. Tip out the board and remove it from its bezel. There are 2 screw holes on the front I/O bezel that fit over screw standoffs on the front I/O board. To install a new front I/O board, insert the board I/O ports into their cutouts on the bezel and press the holes on the bezel over the standoffs on the board. Replace the 2 Torx 15 screws to secure the bezel to the board. The top edge of the front I/O assembly slides under 2 tabs on the chassis cover. There are also 2 hooked tabs on the bottom cover that secure the bottom of the I/O assembly in place. To replace the front I/O assembly, slide the top edge of the assembly under the top tabs, then press to snap the rest of the module into place under the bottom hooked tabs. To remove the rear I/O bezel, first remove the bezel stand assembly and the chassis cover. There are several hooked tabs that secure the rear I/O bezel to the PC. Use a tool to pull out on each of the 4 hooked tabs on the hard drive bracket side of the bezel. And pull the rear I/O bezel off of the unit. The rear I/O bezel has 3 tabs on one side and 4 on the other, that fit into slots on the chassis brackets and over an edge on the top bezel assembly. To replace the rear I/O bezel, place the side of the bezel with the 3 tabs into its slots and press the 4 tabs into place until the bezel is secure. To remove the top bezel assembly, first remove the bezel stand assembly, the chassis cover, the hard drive, the USB dongle, system memory, and the rear I/O bezel. Carefully detach the wireless LAN antenna connectors from the wireless LAN board. Detach the 6 Torx head screws that secure the top bezel assembly to the unit, 3 deep inside the hard drive bay, 2 near the system memory area, and 1 on the top side corner of the PC. Note that you will need a long, slender-barreled screwdriver to access the screws in the hard drive bay area. Remove the single Phillips No. 1 screw near the wireless LAN board area. All the screws for the top assembly are marked with an arrow with 2 circles inside. Pull the top bezel assembly off of the unit. Before replacing the top bezel assembly, make sure the wireless antenna connectors are pressed into their cable guide notch at the bottom side edge of the assembly. To replace the top bezel assembly, press the assembly back onto the top of the unit. Replace the Phillips No. 1 screw near the wireless LAN board. Replace the 6 Torx head screws that secure the top bezel assembly to the unit, 3 in the hard drive bay area, 2 near the system memory area, and 1 on the top side corner. Replace the wireless LAN antenna connectors to the wireless LAN board. The black antenna connector should be connected to port A on the board, and the white antenna should be connected to port B on the board. To remove the speaker, first remove the bezel stand assembly, the chassis cover, the hard drive, the USB dongle, system memory, the rear I/O bezel, and the top bezel assembly. Detach the 3 Torx 15 screws at the top of the unit for the speaker. Detach the remaining 3 Torx 15 screws at the bottom of the unit that secure the speaker in the unit. Note that the bottom speaker screws have a wider head than the top screws. Pull the speaker out through the bottom of the unit. To replace the speaker, slide the speaker in through the bottom of the unit, pressing the base reflex port of the speaker through its cutout on the top chassis metal. Make sure the front I/O cable and hard drive cables are routed underneath the screw flanges of the speaker. Replace the 3 Torx 15 screws at the bottom of the speaker and the 3 Torx 15 screws at the top of the chassis to secure the speaker to the unit. To remove the system fan, first remove the bezel stand assembly, the chassis cover, the hard drive, the USB dongle, system memory, the rear I/O bezel, the top bezel assembly, and the speaker. Detach the fan connector to the motherboard. Remove the fan connector from its cable guide on the metal chassis bracket. Detach the 3 silver Phillips No. 2 screws that secure the fan to the inside sheet metal. Note that the location of the screws will vary depending on whether the system has a GPU. Screws in a GPU unit will be in locations stenciled 1, and units without a GPU will be in locations stenciled 2. Slide the fan down slightly and remove it from the bottom open side of the unit. The fan has 2 small tabs on its outer edge that slide over cutouts on the cooler bracket. The cutout locations appropriate for the fan also depend on whether a GPU is installed in the unit. To replace the system fan, align the fan so that the connector is facing towards the bottom of the unit. Place the tabs into the appropriate cutouts and slide the tabs over their cutouts until the fan is in place. Secure the fan to the inside sheet metal with its 3 silver Phillips No. 2 screws in the locations marked either 1 or 2. Replace the system fan connector into its cable guide on the cooler bracket. Reconnect the system fan to the motherboard. To remove the top chassis metal, first remove the bezel stand assembly, the chassis cover, the hard drive, the USB dongle, system memory, the rear I/O bezel, the top bezel assembly, and the speaker. Detach the 5 Torx 15 screws at the top of the unit that secure the top chassis metal to the other chassis bracket pieces. Detach the Torx 15 screw for the top chassis metal near the system memory shielding cutout. Tip up the corner of the top chassis metal and pull it off of the rest of the chassis brackets. Disconnect the system fan connector from the motherboard. Remove the remaining 6 or 8 Torx 15 screws that secure the remaining metal chassis bracket pieces to each other. 3 near the rear I/O, 1 near the bottom of the system memory shielding cutout, and 2 or 4 by the thermal module area. Pull the cooler and hard drive brackets off of the motherboard tray. There are 3 cutout slots on the cooler and hard drive brackets that fit over locator pegs on the motherboard tray. To connect the metal chassis bracket pieces back together, align the side edges of the cooler and hard drive brackets over the motherboard tray, aligning the pegs into their slot cutouts. Replace the 6 or 8 Torx 15 screws to secure the sheet metal bracket pieces to each other. 2 or 4 for the thermal modules, 1 near the bottom of the system memory shielding cutout, and 3 near the rear I/O. There are 2 slots on the top chassis metal that fit over tabs on the motherboard tray. There are also several small holes on the top chassis metal that fit over locator pegs on the sheet metal pieces. To replace the top of the chassis, align the slots over the tabs and swing and press the top chassis metal into place until all locator pegs are snapped into the holes. Replace the Torx 15 screw near the system memory area for the top chassis metal. Replace the 5 screws at the top of the unit for the top chassis metal. To remove either microphone, first remove the bezel stand assembly and the chassis cover. The right microphone is the microphone with the port for the motherboard microphone connector. The process for removing either microphone is the same. Detach the interconnector from the microphone. Detach the 2 Phillips No. 1 screws securing the microphone to the chassis cover. You will need a short screwdriver to be able to access the screws properly. Pull the microphone off of the cover. To replace a microphone, place the microphone into its location on the chassis cover. Secure with its 2 Phillips No. 1 screws. Replace the connector to the microphone. To remove the GPU heatsink, first remove the bezel stand assembly, the chassis cover, the hard drive, the USB dongle, system memory, the rear I/O bezel, the top bezel assembly, the speaker, and the top chassis metal. Detach the cooler and hard drive brackets from the motherboard tray. Loosen the 4 Phillips No. 2 screws that secure the GPU heatsink to the GPU. Pull the GPU heatsink off of the motherboard. Before replacing a GPU heatsink, first clean off the thermal grease from the GPU. Clean the thermal grease off of the heatsink as well if we're using the same heatsink. Apply new thermal grease or a thermal pad to the GPU. Make sure the pads in between the GPU heatsink and GPU are present. Carefully align the GPU heatsink over the GPU. Tighten the 4 Phillips No. 2 screws to secure the GPU heatsink over the GPU. To remove the GPU, first remove the bezel stand assembly, the chassis cover, the hard drive, the USB dongle, system memory, the rear I/O bezel, the top bezel assembly, the speaker, and the top chassis metal. Detach the cooler and hard drive brackets from the motherboard tray. Remove the GPU heatsink. Detach the two Phillips number 1 screws that secure the GPU to the motherboard. Slide the GPU down and remove it from the motherboard. Remove the GPU bracket if servicing the motherboard or replacing the bracket. To replace a GPU, slide the GPU up into its motherboard socket, aligning it properly over the GPU bracket. Secure the GPU to the motherboard with its two Phillips number 1 screws. To remove the CPU heatsink, remove the bezel stand assembly, the chassis cover, the hard drive, the USB dongle, system memory, the rear I/O bezel, the top bezel assembly, the speaker, and the top chassis metal. Detach the cooler and hard drive brackets from the motherboard tray. Remove the GPU heatsink if a GPU is installed in the unit. Loosen the 3 captured Torx 15 screws for the heatsink assembly. Pull the heatsink assembly out of the unit. Before replacing the heatsink assembly, first clean off the thermal grease from the CPU. Clean off the grease from the heatsink as well. Apply new thermal grease or a thermal pad to the CPU. Carefully align the heatsink assembly back into the unit, positioning it carefully above the CPU. Tighten the 3 Torx 15 screws for the heatsink to secure the heatsink to the motherboard. To remove the CPU, first remove the bezel stand assembly, the chassis cover, the hard drive, the USB dongle, system memory, the rear I/O bezel, the top bezel assembly, the speaker, and the top chassis metal. Detach the cooler and hard drive brackets from the motherboard tray. Remove the graphics card and its attached thermal module if a graphics card is present in the unit. Remove the CPU heatsink. Press down to release the CPU load lever from its retention tab and pull the load lever and load plate away from the socket. Identify pin 1 on the socket by the mark on the corner of the socket stencil. Line up the pin 1 corner of the Intel CPU removal replacement tool over the socket. Press down on the plunger of the removal tool to pick up the CPU from the socket and remove the tool and the CPU from the motherboard. To replace the CPU, first identify pin 1 position on the microprocessor by noting the yellow mark on the corner of the chip assembly. Make sure the Intel CPU staging tool side pins are set to the correct socket type for the CPU. For this unit, it is LGA1151. Place the CPU into the Intel CPU staging tool. When correctly inserted, the small notches on the side of the CPU should align over the side pins on the staging tool. Place the removal replacement tool over the stage, lining up the pin 1 triangles on each tool. Press down on the Removal Replacement tool to pick the CPU up from the stage. Align the Removal Replacement tool again to pin 1 on the motherboard CPU socket. Press the plunger on the Removal Replacement tool to release the CPU into the socket. Swing the load plate down. Lock the load lever under its retaining tab to secure the microprocessor in place. To remove the motherboard, remove the bezel stand assembly, the chassis cover, the hard drive, the USB dongle, system memory, the rear I/O bezel, the top bezel assembly, the speaker, and the top chassis metal. Detach the cooler and hard drive brackets from the motherboard tray. Remove the graphics card and its attached thermal module if a graphics card is present in the unit. Remove the CPU heatsink and CPU. When removing the CPU, install a socket cover on the load plate window before replacing the load plate over the socket. Detach remaining system connectors from the motherboard. Detach the 2 Torx 15 screws on the outside of the motherboard tray. Detach the 2 silver Phillips No. 2 screws on the main side of the motherboard. Tip the memory edge of the motherboard up and remove it from the unit. Remove the wireless LAN board from the bottom side of the motherboard. Place the motherboard in an anti-static bag. To replace the motherboard, tip the I/O edge of the motherboard into the cutouts on the motherboard tray and carefully press the motherboard into place. Replace the 2 silver Phillips No. 2 screws on the main side of the motherboard. Replace the 2 Torx 15 screws on the motherboard tray side to fully secure the motherboard to the tray. Replace the connectors to the motherboard. To remove the wireless LAN board, remove the bezel stand assembly, the chassis cover, the hard drive, the USB dongle, system memory, the rear I/O bezel, the top bezel assembly, the speaker, and the top chassis metal. Detach the cooler and hard drive brackets from the motherboard tray. Remove the graphics card and its attached thermal module if a graphics card is present in the unit. Remove the CPU heatsink, CPU, and the motherboard from the motherboard tray. Detach the Phillips number 1 screw securing the board in place on the back side of the motherboard. The board will pop up. Pull the board out of its motherboard socket. The wireless LAN board has a notch offset from the center that aligns over a key in its motherboard socket. To replace the wireless LAN board, angle the board into its motherboard socket at a 30-degree angle, engaging the notch on the board over its socket key. Press the board down. Hold it down while replacing the Phillips number 1 screw.